in our worship, we take a couple of minutes to have a conversation with a neighbor. And you scurry around and you connect with somebody, and some do it grumpily and some do it with engagement. I'm going to spare you that this morning. I'm going to do something with you that might be even more difficult. I'm going to ask you to take a moment to have a conversation with yourself. You don't have to go anywhere, but I want you to settle in for this conversation. Put your feet on the floor, get comfortable, take a couple of deep breaths, relax into this conversation. Close your eyes if that helps to stay focused. All I want you to do is, after a couple of deep breaths, just sit and wait and enjoy the presence of being in silence. And if the thoughts come up, let them come up and let them pass like the clouds. Let them drift away. Don't judge them. Just let them be. Take a couple of deep breaths and be. I invite you, as you're ready, to come back into the larger space as you re-enter. So what I'm curious about is what that was like for you. I'm curious about whether lots of thoughts came up, bouncing from one thing to another. We call it the monkey mind, right? Just can't stop thinking about the next thing. Did you have that kind of bouncing around? You notice those thoughts? Did you get a glimpse in between the thoughts that there might be a bit of space, something else? That's the space I want you to pay attention to. I think that's the space that Mary invites us into. I don't think it's possible that Mary could have said yes to the angel if she didn't know that space. I don't really think it's possible for us to say yes to love unless we know the space between our thoughts. Or even the one who admires our thoughts. Did you notice that? You can actually, while you're sitting in silence, watch your thought patterns come and go. You can actually have a conversation with yourself about, oh, I'm thinking that. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that weird? I won't share that with my neighbor. So who's watching your thoughts? Who is that has the capacity, the power, the presence to observe your own thinking? Ever wondered? Well, Mary would say, it's you. And when you have that moment, even the glimpse of that moment, you're home. There's something about simply sitting still, quietly, attentively, paying attention to your breathing, that tends to evoke less agitated, less thought-driven modes of awareness and presence. Parker Palmer said that contemplation is, and this is all contemplation is, creating the space for awareness and presence. Parker Palmer says that contemplation is any way one has of penetrating illusion and touching reality. I have to think that Mary knew this space because she was able to embrace reality, a reality that was so different and unorthodox than she could possibly have imagined. Mary's Let It Be shows us the way of the heart. Now these days, the heart tends to be what we call the seat of emotions and sentimentality, kind of like the corporate office of Hallmark right in our own body, right? But our wisdom traditions that Mary is a very important part of remind us that the heart is the organ of spiritual perception and alignment. It's the way of the heart that allows us to align with the present moment, with reality, with love itself, and the source of love and life. It's always there, waiting to take us home, like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. We know that story. If we don't know Mary, we know Dorothy, right? Well, Dorothy was just like Mary. She was a maiden. The new scriptures call it virgin, but really it means maiden. Mary, no more than 12 or 13. No longer a girl, but not quite yet a woman. Engaged, but not married. Dorothy, exactly the same story. Dorothy, who on our behalf goes on a very long and winding journey before finally realizing that she's wearing the shoes all along that will take her home. And so are we. We wear those shoes to bring us home. Thomas Moore writes, I want to show you a picture. It's a picture Donna Friesen took earlier this fall when she was in Italy in a 15th century church. And it was just tucked away in the corner. And here's this gorgeous picture. It's a little fuzzy, but it's a picture of Mary. And Thomas Moore writes that the images of the maiden, like this one, that have been throughout our history, in art and spirituality, and the power of these images evoke both innocence and the inner life, and at the same time, the power and strength of creativity and courage. Both these things are in this image. Both of these things are in Mary, and they represent something very important for us. Moore believes that this image, the maiden, Mary, the announcement that we heard this morning, invites us to live a question. And the question that he thinks we are invited to ask is, are we modestly going to accept the invitation to new and mysterious life that comes unbidden by the Spirit at regular intervals? Or are we going to trust only ourselves and heroically pursue our own plans and designs? It's a pretty big question. Like Mary, we are all pregnant with the possibility of love. The question really describes two paths that intersect in our heart, in our lives, in our living all the time. The way of the ego and the way of the heart. And they're both within us, and we both must learn to live with them. And we always struggle with the tension of these two paths and what it brings. I think maybe these two paths can be best described and maybe most helpful for us by two different mantras that rose up in the ancient days of the 1960s. Remember those days? I know some of you remember them. You don't have to acknowledge that you remember them. In those days, two prophetic movements called the Rolling Stones and the Beatles came to be. And in these two prophetic movements, we have the two great anthems of humanity. Right? First, the Stones created the revealing anthem, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," the way of the ego. This is the ego's anthem, the continual search for more, seeking a satisfaction that will never come. But we keep trying, and we keep singing the anthem. And then, of course, the Beatles, near the end of their time, actually one of the very last songs they ever wrote. "When I find myself in trouble, Mother Mary comes to me, speaking words of wisdom, let it be, let it be." Now, whether they intended it or not is hard to say. But the Beatles wrote a great anthem for the heart. This is wisdom's continual invitation to you and I. This is the invitation we hear in Mary and her story. When we can practice the way of the heart, let it be. When we can say yes to love, we come home, and love is born again and again and again in us. It's not surprising, perhaps, that down through the centuries, Mary has been called the mother of all contemplatives. All people who take on contemplation in their lives. The question for us, of course, is how do we create space in our contemporary living for the new thing? How is it possible? I want to ask you one more personal question. I'm not supposed to do this in public. I want to ask you how old you are, but I'm going to do it in a polite way, okay? How many people here gathered this morning were born in 1985 or earlier? Just put up your hand. That wasn't too hard. Wow, that's a lot of you. Is there anyone that was born before or after 1985? Thank you. There are people. It is so good to have you here. You have to figure the rest of us out. Here's why I asked the question. It's been suggested that 1985 is this magical moment in our history where we have life before the internet and life after the internet. That's the question. And those who were born at 1985 or earlier are the last generation to remember life before the internet. So, just as previous generations were charmed by the printing press and telephone and the radio and television, future generations will be immersed in the internet and the digital world, and our ever-increasing capacity to remain connected to everyone and everything. That questions about its basic purpose and meaning will have faded from notice. We'll forget the founding myth of the internet. I don't think I need to highlight the benefits of the digital world at all. I think it's remarkable. I love the digital world. I have my smartphone right here. If you want to text me, you can send me a text and I'll see it. It's done amazing things in terms of my family and my relationships and certainly my work. It's changed the way we live in all kinds of great and gifted ways. It's led to incredible social movements like Me Too and the Arab Spring. It's changing the way we connect and tell our story, how we spread our news. Every gift, though, has a shadow. Michael Harris is a Canadian journalist, and he was thinking about this shadow. In fact, he was so immersed in this connectivity, it began to scare him. He took a year off, and he's still a young man, but he took a year off and he wrote about it in a little book that was published just a few years ago called The End of Absence. And he asked this question: what's going to happen when we forget the real purpose of the internet? What's going to happen when it takes over, as it clearly seems to be already doing, our living? In The End of Absence, he suggests that there is a shadow to this gift, and we must pay attention to the shadow. He calls it the end of absence because he really believes we are losing absence in our life. Space, the loss of space, of downtime, of daydreaming, of stillness, of idleness. He talks at the beginning of the book about his memory of being a child and going out to the field behind his house and lying there for what he thinks of as or remembers as hours just staring at the sky, playing in the field. And he laments the fact that he has no space like that in his living now. He says, the daydreaming silences in our lives are filled. The burning solitudes are extinguished. Researchers have described the state that many of us find ourselves in the digital world as the continuing partial attention. Dr. Gary Small from UCLA said that once we get used to this state, we tend to thrive on its perpetual connectivity. It feeds our egos and our sense of self-worth and even our identities, and it becomes insatiable. We live in an ecosystem designed to disrupt us, and it will take us for a relentless ride if we let it. So again, I'm not saying there's not a gift in this. It's incredible how it's changed our living for the better. But the point is, if we lose our attention, if we're consumed by a partial attention and a perpetual connectivity, how is it that we find the space to be at home? We can become connected to everything and everyone except ourselves. That for me is a risk. That's a flag. It's a shadow that we need to pay attention to. Blaise Pascal, the philosopher, wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone." Remarkable. He wrote that 400 years ago. 400 years ago. We have been a restless people long before the internet. Right? This space thing's been a challenge for us since Mary and before that. So what do we do? Who teaches us to be alone, to connect inwardly with our deeper self? How do we embrace this space for contemplation? And I don't just mean sitting in a room for 20 minutes in complete silence. Some of us love to do that. It's a natural thing for us. Others, that would be the last thing we'd want to do. It's like going to the dentist, right? But contemplation doesn't just mean sitting in silence. It means creating in our lives space. It could be baking bread. It could be tending the roses. It could be taking long, slow walks to no place in particular. Or we might find ourselves being interiorly drawn to painting or to reading or writing poetry or listening to certain kinds of music. It doesn't matter as long as we can bring our attention to the activity, our presence to the practice. I think this may be the most important spiritual and psychological practice of the next century. And you know, it was interesting. Michael Harris concluded in his book, one of his last lines, "I found myself desperate for sanctuary." Wow. A young man who had no tradition in the life of the church, who had no real spiritual life that he could name or recognize, but he found himself desperate for sanctuary. The space, the place where we can say, yes, let it be. This Christmas, I invite you to find space. In whatever ways that's possible, in whatever ways are helpful, so that you may know God's yes, and you may bring your yes to the world, that love may be born again and again. And to that I say, amen. So we know you're humming the song. So now we're going to stand and we're going to sing it.